Okay, thank you. Speaking of intellectual disasters, we'll be able to see what I have to say here. Like how you set me up there, Bob.
My pleasure.
Okay. Whoops. Okay, and you should know that PowerPoint is not my natural habitat, so please forgive me. This is probably the most exciting screen of all of them, so gaze at that with wonder. Okay, so I've added one new person to this as I started getting into, well, crap, what am I doing here? As I started getting into this, I was first struck by something I had read in Ockham in his one of his quodlibets, which suggested something I had read before in Augustine. And then I started kind of working my way back in various directions. And so now I'm looking at Kataleptic impressions in Ockham, Scotus, and Henry of Ghent. But I'm going to start with Cicero and with Zeno. So I found some pictures. So again, this is the second most exciting screen, I guess. Just to give you a sense of who these people are and their dates. Most of you know this, but just in case. So Zeno was very early. Then we have Cicero and Augustine. Again, there's a big gap between Cicero and Augustine. Just be aware of that. And an even bigger gap between Augustine and Henry. And then, of course, Henry, Scotus, and Ockham, they're relatively close together in time. So let me go ahead and start the paper then. I'll be reading the paper. This is largely a textual kind of thing, so I'm going to be putting up lots of text here, kind of in the old-fashioned way, so it doesn't really fit with the way other people have been doing things. I like the way other people have been doing things, but this is just what I have and what I'm used to doing. Okay, so this paper will explore the gradual erosion of an important aspect of Stoic epistemology in the later Middle Ages. This is not a comprehensive survey. Instead, it will examine 4 texts, each of which draws explicitly from the preceding one, and each of which leads us further from the original Stoic notion over a period of 1600 years. In the final section, I'll examine sections of a few further works that are not part of this explicit chain of transmission, but that nevertheless exhibit trace elements of our Stoic starting point. Later medieval epistemology was not essentially Stoic, but I aim to show that Stoicism nevertheless played a role in its development. One might view the history of epistemology as a history of responses to the criterion problem. The criterion is roughly the incontrovertible mark of knowledge, and the criterion problem, as I intended here, can be further subdivided into 2 main subproblems. The first, the ontological criterion problem, is a problem of what counts as an incontrovertible mark of knowledge. The second, the epistemological criterion problem, is a problem of how one can know when one is properly grasping that incontrovertible mark. Some hold that the epistemological criterion problem is unimportant once the ontological criterion problem is solved. Aristotelians, with their focus on a cognitive process that succeeds in normal circumstances, tend towards this approach. Among them are the later medieval thinkers Henry of Ghent, Scotus, and William of Ockham. Others argue that solving the ontological problem isn't enough in itself. The skeptics of the ancient and Hellenistic periods held this view. In what follows, I'll focus first on the Stoic answer to the criterion problem and the skeptical response to their proposed solution. The debate concerns what the Stoics, how am I supposed to do this? There we go. The debate concerns, what the Stoics call a cataleptic impression, or fantasia kataleptiki, and their discussions can be seen not only in the fragmentary writings of Greek Stoic and skeptical philosophers themselves, but also in the works of Cicero and Augustine. I'll then turn my attention to the thought of Henry, Scotus, and Ockham. Though none of those later philosophers reference cataleptic impressions by name, I'll argue that this notion nevertheless is an important aspect of their anti-skeptical positions. Okay, so let's talk about Stoic cataleptic impressions first. Much has been written about Stoic cataleptic impressions, and much will be glossed over in my brief account here. It should first be noted that there were many Stoic accounts of such impressions, as a 500-year-long or 900-year-long tradition, depending on how you read things. Distinct explanations and versions existed, and given the fragmentary nature of our original Stoic text, pinning definite versions on particular individuals is a question best left to other studies. I'll instead present a generalized, brief explanation. As with their Epicurean contemporaries, Stoics were empiricists in basic orientation. For both schools, knowledge begins with, and is impossible without, sense impressions. But whereas Epicureans notoriously held that all sense impressions are true, the Stoics were more discerning. For them, only some sense impressions are true, and of those that are true, only some are cataleptic. Furthermore, a sense impression is a material item. With few exceptions, everything that exists for Stoics is material, and it is best described as an impression in the soul, which itself is a material item as well. These presentations can be veridical or not, and they can be consciously acknowledged, that is, they can be assented to or not. Our epistemological goal, of course, is to give assent only to veridical impressions, and thus to avoid assenting to non-veridical ones. No great surprises so far, but we cannot stop there. Assenting to a veridical impression has worth for the Stoics only if one sees the truth of that presentation in a thorough and unshakable way. As they go on to explain, there are certain impressions that have this special status, which again are called kataleptic impressions. They characterize a kataleptic impression as one that meets each of the following conditions. Let me see if I can get this, there we go, in a formulation that came to be known as Zeno's definition. First condition, it comes from an existing object. Second, it is in accordance with that existing object. And third, it could not come from any other object. I'll be talking a lot about this definition as we go on, and particularly this third condition that we talked a lot about. It should be noted that both conditions 1 and 3 are causal requirements, and condition 2 is an ontological requirement. There are no purely epistemic requirements in the definition, as stated. Still, Stoics refer to kataleptic impressions as clear and distinct, and they also describe them as thorough and complete. As they explain, a Stoic sage will see the clarity, distinctness, veridicality, and thoroughness of a kataleptic impression, and thus will assent to it on the basis of its self-justificatory status. But this assent by itself is not enough for Stoics. Knowledge of a kataleptic impression occurs only when it is securely and unshakably grasped, and only when it cannot be overturned by argument or by further impressions. The founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, liked to illustrate this with his hand analogy. An open palm, let me see if I can get it up there, if you can see my little image there. An open palm is an impression simpliciter. A slightly closed palm is an assent to an impression simpliciter. A closed fist is an assent to a kataleptic impression. And finally, another hand, tightly holding the closed fist, is knowledge of the kataleptic impression. So how did the skeptics respond? One line of argument was a generalized one. For any criterion whatsoever, one cannot be certain of that criterion without appealing either to an infinite chain of further justifications for it, or to the claim that the criterion itself is self-justifying, which amounts to circularity. This generalized attack, of course, applies to the Stoic definition of a kataleptic impression. The Stoics countered this by saying that skeptics couldn't make such arguments without being certain of the truth of their own anti-Stoic premises. And since skeptics don't claim to have such certainty, their arguments ultimately fail. In short, then, the Stoics held that kataleptic impressions are self-justifying and are, in principle, possible to grasp, at least for the sage. For the philosophers I'll be focusing on later, Henry of Ghent, John Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham, knowledge of Stoicism wasn't direct. None knew Greek, and the original Stoic texts weren't available. Almost all knowledge of Stoicism came through secondary sources, and the most important for our purposes here are Cicero and Augustine. I'll begin by exploring a few key passages from Cicero's Academica, and then I'll turn my focus to Augustine's Contra Academicos, which relies heavily on Cicero's work. Okay, here we go. Take a sip here. And I should warn you, they're doing construction right outside my office, so you may hear construction noise at some point out here. Okay, so talking about Cicero. Cicero's Academica includes significant discussion of Stoicism and skepticism, and one of the primary topics is Zeno's definition of kataleptic impressions. Cicero gives some direct translations of the term catalepsis. First one, and this is A on the screen, knowledge, that is the apprehension, or to translate literally, the grasp they call catalepsis. A bit later, he gives us a relatively full account of Zeno's definition of such a kataleptic impression, saying that, and this is B, something apprehensible is an impression from what is, stamped, impressed, and molded just as it is. No such impression would be apprehensible if one that came from what is was such that there could be one just like it from what is not. Unquote. As Cicero also explains, the Stoics held that all material items are radically individualized. As he says, quote, everything of its own kind, nothing is identical with something else. No strand of hair is just like another, nor any grain of sand, unquote. As a result, this individuation applies to each material impression as well. Because each is distinct from all others, as the Stoics held, it seems to follow that Zeno's third condition will always be met by any impression that meets conditions 1 and 2. Skeptics respond, however, by pointing out the difference between being ontologically distinct and being epistemically distinguishable. using examples involving ontologically distinct but epistemically indistinguishable eggs and ontologically distinct but epistemically indistinguishable human twins. For skeptics, Zeno's third condition never holds. Every apparently true impression could have had another source. Beyond that, Cicero explicitly recounts Zeno's hand analogy in the Academica, and he references the criterion or judicium by name multiple times in the work as well. This can be seen, for example, when Cicero portrays the competing philosophical schools of his time as having distinct accounts of the criterion. Okay, so now we're up to C. So, quote, Protagoras gives one criterion, thinking that each person's impression is true for him. The Cyrenaics give another, since they think that there is no criterion except one's internal experience. And Epicurus another, limiting the criteria to the senses, our conceptions of things, and pleasures. Meanwhile, Plato thought the criterion of truth, along with truth itself, was inaccessible to opinion in the senses. He took it to belong to thought itself and the mind. Unquote. Cicero, as an adherent of academic skepticism, ultimately explains why Zeno's criterion, a cataleptic impression, won't really work since nothing meets the third condition. And this is D on the screen. Quote, someone whose impressions are shared by what's true and false alike can't have any criterion or mark of truth at all. In sum, Cicero was thoroughly familiar with the debates surrounding Stoic cataleptic impressions, and significant portions of his Academica are explicitly focused on that issue in particular. From Cicero's skeptical perspective, no impression meets a high standard set by Zeno, and hence a wise person should never assent to anything, but rather the wise person's goal should instead be to approve impressions that seem plausible or truth-like. Okay, let's move on now to Augustine. So Augustine's knowledge of the Stoic skeptic epistemological debates is especially reliant on Cicero. Since Augustine wasn't overly conversant with Greek, it's unsurprising to see him adopt many of Cicero's characterizations of these Greek philosophical traditions. Most notable are the ways in which Augustine explains, and this is A on the screen, quote, the definition given by Zeno the Stoic. He said, the truth that can be apprehended is impressed on the mind by what it comes from in such a way that it couldn't be from something other than what it does come from. This can be more briefly and plainly expressed as follows. The truth can be grasped by means of these signs, and what is false can't have these signs. Unquote. As he continues to explain Zeno's purpose, he says that Zeno raised the question, and this is B on the screen, quote, whether the truth can be apprehended as something new and untried. He contended that nothing can be apprehended except what is true in such a way that it can be distinguished from the false by a dissimilarity in their marks. Unquote. Later in the text, he gives a similar characterization of Zeno's definition. This is C, quote, the appearance that can be grasped and apprehended is such that it does not have signs in common with what is false. Unquote. Augustine doesn't mention the individuation point outlined in the Cicero section above, possibly due to the fact that he rejects Stoic materialism in general. This is seen when Augustine argues that Zeno failed to realize, and this is D, quote, that nothing could be grasped unless it were such as he himself defined it to be, and that nothing of this sort could be found in bodies, to which he attributed everything. Quote. In a Platonic fashion, Augustine holds that the senses are largely untrustworthy unless one sees the truth in another way. This is E, quote, someone who gazes upon an exemplar does indeed rightly approve an image of it. Quote. Thus, Augustine comes at the criterion problem obliquely. He doesn't use the Greek term fantasia kataleptiki, but he does describe the Stoic notion using Cicero's terminology, including comprehensio, visum, impressum, and percepi posse. I just read a neat paper I stumbled across last night. It talks about, if you look back at the definitions I'm giving you, Cicero uses the word visum, where Augustine tends to change that to verum. And the person who wrote the paper, what's his name, Tobias Reinhardt, he's at Oxford, he's a classicist. He was arguing that there was an intentional choice on Augustine's part to try to make things a little bit clearer. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. It's like I said, it's a nice little paper. Okay. In fact, both the very beginning and the very end of the Contra Academicos, as well as many other points throughout the text, make reference to the centrality of apprehending the truth. Argumentatively, Augustine doesn't rely upon the original Stoic notion of material cataleptic impressions either, and he instead finds certainty in what we will later call the inner teacher, which is his Christianized way of describing the recollection of Platonic forms. Augustine sees this as the illumination provided by God's divine ideas. Among the truths so discovered are logical truths, mathematical truths, and seeming claims, such as it seems white to me or something like that. But this doesn't mean that Zeno's definition is completely useless for Augustine, because he does employ the definition as an example of a logical truth. Either Zeno's definition is true or it is not true. This, he says, as a logical truth, cannot be denied. Augustine keeps alive the criterion problem for his later medieval readers, but he dismisses Stoic Kataleptic impressions as a plausible response. Interestingly, despite the fact that Cicero uses the term criterion or judicium over 80 times in the Academica, Augustine doesn't use judicium at all in the Contra Academicus. Similarly, he doesn't use Cicero's other term for a criterion, regula. That may be wrong about that. I got to go back and look. Which he uses to translate the Epicurean canon. For Epicureans, a canon is a rule or measuring stick by which one judges truth. In any case, due to Augustine's terminological omissions, for later medievals who read the Contra Academicos or who read Cicero's Academica through an Augustinian lens, the basic issues involved in the Stoic notions of the criterion and the Kataleptic impression continue to swirl without full recognition of the Stoic background of the terms involved. These later thinkers tend to follow the trend that we saw in Cicero and that was amplified in Augustine of interpreting the third condition of Zeno's definition, again, that a kataleptic impression could not come from another object, less as a causality requirement and more as an epistemic one, centered on one's subjective ability to distinguish a true impression from a false one. This is what we see in Henry of Ghent and later in Scotus. Okay, put this on, there's Henry. I found this picture online. Is anybody having any idea what the source of that one is? I don't know if you guys, I'd never seen this before. Anyway, I don't know if that's really him or not. Okay, Henry of Ghent was quite familiar with Augustine's Contra Academicos and to a lesser degree with Cicero's Academica. I'll focus in particular on a few questions from Henry's Summa Questionum Ordinarium, which Bob Pasnow knows quite well because I was using his translations for the most part, though I will make use of later questions from the same work as well. Henry mentions the Stoics at times in these questions and even mentions Zeno of Citium once, but he ultimately declares himself to be following Augustine's lead, and he defends a Christianized Platonic/Aristotelian syncretic position. Henry cites other works of Augustine, most notably De Trinitate, De Civitate Dei, on diverse questions, various letters. He cites Aristotle, primarily the metaphysics, as well as Avicenna and Averroes in these questions. A close look, however, reveals Henry also to be relying on Zeno's definition and the basic notion of a kataleptic impression to characterize his own view. For Henry, the pure truth, or veritas sincera, found in the uncreated or divine exemplar, is the foundation of all knowledge, and it is accessible to at least some humans. Even so, Henry agrees with the skeptics to a point, arguing that sensory experience and what he calls the created or sensory exemplar, one grasps by starting with the senses, cannot be a basis for full knowledge. And this is the first quote, A. An exemplar of this sort has a likeness with the false as well as with the true. They cannot be distinguished. But the pure truth is not perceived unless it's discerned from what is false. Therefore, it is impossible through such an exemplar to have certain knowledge and a certain cognition of the truth. Thus, a thoroughly empiricist epistemology, which the Stoics happen to have, won't work, according to Henry. Instead, one must look to the divine exemplar as the criterion of truth. Henry discusses many important epistemological arguments, such as the MeLO problem, but I'll focus on those elements of his writings that are more directly related to Zeno's definition and to the criterion problem. Henry's nickname, as most of you know, was the verbose doctor, and you're going to see I have a lot more quotes from him than anyone else, so I thought it'd be kind of fitting. Okay, so next section, Henry and Zeno's definition. Henry never fully lays out Zeno's definition of a kataleptic impression, as both Cicero and Augustine do, but he does discuss each of the definition's conditions separately. The first condition, that a kataleptic impression comes from an existing object, receives the least attention from Henry, perhaps due to its uncontroversial nature. Here's the best example, and this is A in your text, or excuse me, B in your on your screen. Quote, every cognitive power, through its cognition, apprehends a thing just as it has existence in itself outside the cognizer, unquote. Henry never expresses doubt about the existence of external objects, nor does he express doubt about the basic Aristotelian manner of gaining sensory information, at least in broad strokes. For Henry, we gain sensory information from external objects through the sensible species of those objects that are sensed in the sense organs. Zeno's second condition, that a cataleptic impression is in accordance with the existing object, is explored in a little bit more detail by Henry. He begins by discussing the way, this would be C, quote, one can know something and perceive a thing as it is. For in sensory cognition, a thing is truly perceived as it is, without any deception or mistake, by a sense that during its own action of sensing its proper object is not contradicted by a truer sense, or by an intellection received from a different truer sense. Unquote. For Henry, then, the senses normally work and should be trusted unless one receives more reliable, contradicting information. This provides an ontological explanation of what is required for a cataleptic impression, but of course it doesn't provide a clear epistemological mark by which one knows one has grasped what is true in the thing. As he puts it elsewhere, and this is quote D, quote, a thing is determinately perceived through an undeceived sense at the time at which it is not deceived, unquote. And a bit later, this is E, quote, a sense is called true because of grasping a thing as it is, unquote. For Henry, then, to grasp what is true in a thing, the thing must exist, we must gain sensory information from that thing, and that information must be accurate. But grasping what is true in a thing for the senses is distinct from having knowledge in the full sense. For him, this only occurs when one grasps the truth. Grasping the truth also must meet the second condition of Zeno's definition, as Henry puts it, and this is F, quote, the truth is a kind of adequation of thing and intellect, unquote. But grasping the truth goes beyond the first and second conditions. Henry explicitly discusses Zeno's third condition, that a cataleptic impression cannot come from any other object, multiple times in these questions, following both Cicero and Augustine. He lays out the basis of the dispute by explaining the skeptical position. All right, this is the next page. Okay, this is G, quote, their reasoning, according to what Augustine recounts, was this. They said that what is true can be recognized only by signs that cannot have the character of what is false, so that the true is discerned from the false by distinct marks, and does not have signs in common with what is false. Thus, what is true cannot appear false, but they believed it impossible that such signs could be found. Unquote. Henry thinks there is a way out of the problem. This is H. But when every impediment is lifted, there is no chance that it will err or apprehend its proper object otherwise than as it is. Truth that is certain can't be grasped for long by depending entirely on the criterion of the senses. Nevertheless, truth that is entirely certain is grasped through the senses by abstracting that which was apprehended by an undeceived sense and forming a judgment or criterion in intellect where what was apprehended remains as if unchanged, unable to be obscured by truth-like species of phantasms. And I'm taking some, one thing I want you guys to notice is eudicium, Bob, what did I do? Pick up back here. Yeah, Bob had generally translated eudicium as judgment, which makes a lot of sense, but it's the same word that Cicero uses for criterion. So in some contexts, I think it makes some sense to use criterion there. But I just wanted to flag that for people as you're looking at these texts. Okay. So how exactly does the intellect do this? According to Henry, claiming to follow Plato's Timaeus, and let's see, I need to go to the next slide. This is I, quote, there are two exemplars, one kind made and constructed, and the other kind perpetual and unchangeable. The first exemplar of a thing is its universal species existing within the soul, through which the soul acquires a cognition of all the individuals it stands for. This exemplar is caused by the thing. The second exemplar is the divine art containing the ideal formulations of all things, unquote. With a clear nod to Zeno's third condition, Henry explains how the first century exemplar, and this is J on your screen, quote, since it is an intention and species of a sensible thing abstracted from a phantasm, has a likeness with the false as well as with the true. So as far as a species is concerned, they cannot be distinguished. But the pure truth is not perceived unless it is discerned from what is false. Therefore, it's impossible through such an exemplar to have certain knowledge and a certain cognition of the truth. Thus, if we are to possess certain knowledge of the truth, the mind must run away from the senses and sensible things and from every intention, no matter how universal and abstracted from the senses, and turn toward the unchangeable truth existing above the mind. The truth does not have an image of the false from which it can be discerned. From which it cannot be discerned. Thus, for Henry, Zeno's first two conditions, that a cataleptic impression comes from an existing object and that it accords with that object, are met by an unimpeded sensory process, which results in grasping what is true in an object using the first exemplar. The third condition, that the impression cannot come from another object, is only realized once one has grasped the truth through the second exemplar or divine idea. Hence, this second exemplar serves as a criterion of truth for Henry. We'll expand on this reading of Henry next. So let me go on to the next screen. Henry quotes from Augustine's letter to Dioscorus. If you guys have never read that, it's pretty funny. I recommend that you do it, because some poor fella writes him a letter. He was a former student. He was a student of a student of his, I believe. And Augustine just gives him a really hard time for pages and pages about how terrible it is if he's bugging him with these important questions. But he nevertheless answers him. But anyway, if you just want to get a different sense of Augustine, you might get from some other words. It's worth a quick read. It's not very good. Okay, anyway. Henry quotes from this letter to help set the stage, and this is K. Quote, although the Epicureans said that the bodily senses are never deceived, whereas the Stoics conceded that they sometimes are deceived, they still both proposed a rule, or as I'm going to suggest here, a criterion for grasping the truth within the senses. Henry also explains how Augustine's approach differs from this. Quote, and this is L. Augustine claims that the principles of certain knowledge and of cognizing the truth consist in the eternal, unchangeable rules or reasons existing in God. In this way, there can be certain and fixed knowledge of changeable things, no matter how changeable they are. Unquote. This occurs because, and this is quote M, the intention of the truth in a thing can be apprehended only by apprehending its conformity to its second exemplar. Unquote. For Henry, then, when one grasps the second exemplar by intuiting the divine idea of the thing, one thereby has a mark of the truth that cannot be confused with what is false. Such a second exemplar meets the third condition of Zeno's definition and hence serves as a criterion of truth. But couldn't the skeptic still ask how one can be certain one is grasping such a divine idea? Henry acknowledges this possibility, but seemingly discounts it. So I don't have this one up on the screen, but quote, a human being cannot by purely natural means attain the rules of the eternal light so as to see in them the pure truth of things. God offers him to whomever he wants and takes him away from whomever he wants. Thus, God sometimes bestows the eternal rules on bad people. Sometimes God takes these same rules away from such people and allows them to fall into error. As a result, Henry explains our ability to know the pure truth through the second or uncreated exemplar in much of the way the Stoics characterize the sages of their own tradition. Stoic sages see things clearly and distinctly and have no chance of erring once they grasp things in a proper way. Henry provides a Platonic/Augustinian criterion of truth, and it accords with Zeno's definition of a cataleptic impression. To make the connection to the Stoic notion even clearer, Henry uses the primary term eudicium that Cicero uses to translate criterion, and he uses it to describe Augustine's view. Again, Bob translated this as judgment most of the way, all the way in the text that I was looking at, which may make more sense, but we'll just take a look here. So this is in, quote, for every other likeness impressed by any exemplar abstracted from the thing itself is incomplete, obscure, and foggy, and hence no certain criterion regarding the truth of the thing can be had through it. On this account, Augustine compares the first likeness and criterion through it to the clear air above the clouds, and compares the second likeness and criterion through it to the foggy and obscure air beneath the clouds. Unquote. And again, Henry makes a similar move discussing, and this is O, quote, two claims based on which Augustine argues that a certain criterion is not established in the senses. First, the changeability of sensible things. Second, the fallibility of the senses themselves. But from an apprehension made through the senses, by turning away from the senses so that a criterion is made in reason, pure truth should indeed be sought from the senses. This is so to the extent that it can be discerned either by purely natural means through the criterion of reason in a pure natural light, or else absolutely through the criterion of intellect and the clarity of the eternal light. Quote. Henry uses the term eudicium in this context many other times as well, in 1.2, 1.8, a couple times there, 1.12 and 2.1 from his Summa. So for Henry, those Stoic cataleptic impressions aren't mentioned explicitly. There are repeated arguments concerning the three conditions of Zeno's definition, with a special emphasis on the third condition, taken epistemically rather than causally, as well as multiple instances of terminological continuity with Cicero's translations of catalepsis. Okay, so that's it for Henry. Let me move on to Scotus next. In his Ordinatio 134, Scotus discusses and largely rejects Henry's epistemological moves. In this question, Scotus gives no evidence of having direct access to Cicero's Academica, but he does quote a few brief passages from Augustine's Contra Academicos that aren't cited by Henry. I've got to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that's right. I know he cites the Contra Academicos, but it's whether Augustine cites it or not. He could do it in other works, but I don't think he does in the Contra Academicos. In any case, he more commonly cites Aristotle's texts as well as other works of Augustine. Here we have a clear break with the Ciceronian Augustinian terminological tradition, and rather than talking about grasping the truth in the criterion in Stoic terms, Scotus instead talks primarily about certitude, certitudo, evidence, evidentia, and cognition, cognitio. He's addressing the same basic worries as the Stoics in some sense, but he's doing it in a new way, at least terminologically. Here, Scotus mentions the academics by name multiple times, and takes himself to be explaining their view as mediated by Henry before refuting it in the next section of his question. But he never references either the Stoics or Zeno by name. He does talk about Henry's discussion of Zeno's third condition, again, that a cataleptic impression couldn't come from another object another number of times. He first mentions it when laying out Henry's view, saying that for Henry, and this is A on the screen, quote, "No one possesses certain and infallible knowledge of the truth unless he can distinguish the truth from what has only the appearance of truth. For if he is unable to tell the true from the false, or from what appears to be true, he can still be in doubt whether he is being deceived or not. Now, truth cannot be distinguished from what merely appears to be true by the first created sensory exemplar." Scotus thinks Henry requires too much. First, he says, and this is quote B on the screen, "Knowledge is of a principle is immutable in the sense that it cannot change from truth to falsity. But what is necessarily and immutably true causes this evident knowledge of itself in the mind. As evident, such a truth is not subject to the mind, so that it could appear either true or false." By principle, Scotus is referring to a self-evident proposition or proposition per se note, such as a whole is greater than its part. Such propositions, according to Scotus, can be known with certainty once one knows the terms of those propositions without any special divine influence. They therefore meet Zeno's third condition. But in agreement with the Stoics and contra Henry, this certainty can even be found in sensory context. Scotus argues that in cases in which phantasms occur, such as dreams, one can appeal to just such a self-evident proposition to extricate oneself from doubt. So this might get you out of one of Bob's worries from his earlier paper. So this will be my next page. Quote C, quote, "I reply that the following truth reposes in the mind. A faculty does not err in regard to an object that is properly proportioned to it, unless that faculty is indisposed. Now, it is known to the intellect that the imaginative faculty is not indisposed during a waking state, for it is self-evident to the intellect that when it knows it's awake, and that consequently the imagination is not bound in a waking state as it is in sleep." Of course, this reply is unlikely to satisfy the skeptic, so Scotus famously resorts to an argument ad hominem. Quote, "If you hold that nothing is self-evident, I will not argue with you, for it's clear that you are a quid learner not to be convinced." Unquote. As with Henry, Scotus never seriously questions the existence of external objects, so he too doesn't give any significant treatment of Zeno's first condition. The second condition, that a cataleptic impression must be in accordance with its object, is discussed to some degree, however, for Scotus says that, and this is D, quote, "Once these intelligibles are grasped and formulated in a proposition, they cause the conformity of what is grasped to themselves." Quote. So to sum up for Scotus, there's limited terminological continuity with the Ciceronian Augustinian tradition of talking about the Stoic criterion and cataleptic impressions, but nevertheless, Scotus claims to directly answer the skeptic by arguing that there are things that meet this definition, propositions per se note and the truths, even sensory ones, that follow from it. Scotus prefers to talk about knowledge that can't be doubted, using the terms evident and certain instead. Okay, that's it for Scotus. On to our last figure, William of Ockham. So William of Ockham covers related issues in various texts, but I'm going to concentrate on a few questions from his Quodlibets, as well as a brief passage from his Ordinatio. The main context of his discussions is the distinction between intuitive cognition, or cognitio intuitiva, and abstractive cognition, or cognitio abstractiva. These concepts, which were introduced by Scotus and reinterpreted by many medieval philosophers who followed him, are widely discussed in the secondary literature. Though there's no significant terminological continuity between them and the ways the Stoic notions of the criterion and cataleptic impressions were explored by Cicero, Augustine, Henry, and Scotus, there are surprisingly strong similarities between Ockham's characterization of an intuitive cognition in the original sense of the third condition of Zeno's definition, that a cataleptic impression could not come from any other object. For Ockham, the basic distinction between intuitive cognitions and abstractive cognitions concerns their connection to the existence of the items being cognized. As he explains, this is A on the screen, quote, "Through an intuitive cognition, I judge not only that a thing exists when it exists, but also that it does not exist when it does not exist. I do not judge in either of these ways through an abstractive cognition." Unquote. An intuitive cognition necessarily involves the grasping of the item's existence, while abstractive cognitions do not. For example, if I intuitively cognize my wife's dog Willow, then I see immediately that she in fact exists. But if I'm thinking about my other recently deceased dog named Luke, I have no such immediate cognition of his existence, and hence my cognition of him is abstractive. Ockham goes further than this, however. For him, an intuitive cognition is not merely a potentially incorrect judgment that the item cognized in fact exists, rather it functions as a criterion of truth. Echoing Scotus, Ockham uses a related term, evident cognition, to indicate this. This is B on your screen, quote, "Intuitive cognition of a thing is a cognition that enables us to know whether the thing exists or does not exist in such a way that if the thing exists, then the intellect immediately judges it exists and evidently knows that it exists unless it's impeded." Unquote. So why are such cognitions evident or certain? Ockham considers two different accounts of intuitive cognitions, which correspond quite nicely with the competing epistemic and causal accounts of cataleptic impressions we've seen in the earlier thinkers above. Ockham begins with an objection to his own view, which roughly repeats the skeptic's distinguishability objection to the Stoic cataleptic impressions that we saw all the way back in Cicero's Academia. All right, here's the objection. Quote, this is C on your screen. "It does not seem that an intuitive cognition is a proper cognition, since any given intuitive cognition is equally a likeness of the one singular thing and of another exactly similar thing, and it equally represents both the one and the other. Therefore, it does not seem to be more a cognition of the one than a cognition of the other." Unquote. Ockham understands an intuitive cognition causally rather than epistemically. Here's his response, D on your screen. "I reply that an intuitive cognition is a proper cognition of a singular thing, not because of its greater likeness to the one thing than to the other, but because it is naturally caused by the one thing and not by the other, and is not able to be caused by the other. Hence, it's not because of a likeness that an intuitive cognition, rather than a first abstractive cognition, is called a proper cognition of a singular thing. Rather, it's only because of causality." Unquote. Abstractive cognitions, on the other hand, do not have such a strong one-to-one causal linkage. All right, this is E on your screen. Quote, "No simple abstractive cognition is more a likeness of one singular thing than of another exactly like it, nor is it caused by, or apt to be by nature to be caused by, just one thing." Quote. But can intuitive cognitions truly serve as a certain criterion of truth? To translate the earlier skeptics' worries about Stoic cataleptic impressions into Ockham's terms, then, the fear is that all apparently intuitive cognitions are in fact abstractive, that there is no clear way to distinguish the two types of impressions, and thus that certainty isn't possible. For Ockham, however, this is a purely definitional matter. He considers this in a related objection. What if an omnipotent God creates a cognition in us that appears to be intuitive, but is actually abstractive? Here's the way he answers. This is F on your screen. "God cannot cause in us a cognition through which it would evidently appear to us that a thing is present when it's absent, since this involves a contradiction. For evident cognition implies that things are in reality as they are asserted to be by the proposition to which the assent is given. Nonetheless, God can cause an act of believing through which I believe a thing to be present when it's in fact absent, and I claim that this belief cognition will be abstractive and not intuitive." Unquote. Thus, for Ockham, when normal sensory cognitions are occurring, things that are happening naturally, we can be certain that our intuitive cognitions are in fact intuitive, and hence that they can serve as a criterion of truth. But when supernatural possibilities come into play, our certainty is lost. In such cases, it's not because intuitive cognitions are now less certain, It is said because such seemingly intuitive cognitions are not truly intuitive and instead are abstractive. Ockham saves intuitive cognitions from the skeptic's objection, but he does so only by pushing the worries to a different level, one in which one must determine if a supernatural force is interfering with one's cognitions. There's no direct evidence that Ockham read Cicero's Academica, at least none that I've seen, Augustine's Contra Academicos, or any other accounts of Stoic cataleptic impressions, and he doesn't use the relevant Ciceronian or Augustinian terminology when discussing intuitive abstractive cognition. But the fact that he considers the two main interpretations of Zeno's third condition might be more than a coincidence. Okay, so conclusion. In a 1981 paper, Wingert argues that there are strong parallels between Stoicism and some aspects of later medieval thought, and he specifically mentions Henry of Ghent, Scotus, and Ockham in this regard, with some attention to both cataleptic impressions and Zeno's definition. Though he presents no evidence that the Stoics influenced Scotus and Ockham directly, he hypothesizes that Cicero's Academica might have been in wider circulation than philosophers at the time acknowledged in the writings. Picabe in 2009 also discusses both Henry and Scotus and affords some attention to the criterion problem for me from a skeptical perspective, but not a Stoic one in their writings. Others have explored the connections between Stoicism and further aspects of later medieval thought generally in areas such as logic, metaphysics, and ethics. If my textual analysis here is correct, it gives yet more evidence of a general Stoic influence, though pretty hidden. So I'll finish with a quick summary of the main argument I'm presenting here. So initially, the Stoics developed the cataleptic impression to answer the criterion problem. In response to skeptical attacks, they developed a definition of it that emphasized the third condition, that each cataleptic impression cannot be produced by anything beyond what actually it produces it. In one sense, this is tautologous, since ignoring cases of multiple contributing causes, a particular impression X, actually produced by an object Y, cannot simultaneously be produced by a third object Z. In Cicero's Academica, the emphasis of the third condition begins to shift from being a causality requirement to being a subjective or epistemic distinguishability requirement. A cataleptic impression for him can't be such that it could be shared by something true and false alike. In other words, we must be able to know that a given cataleptic impression is truly produced by what it was in fact produced by. Cicero doesn't think any impression meets this requirement, and thus he concludes that the criterion problem ultimately cannot be solved. In the Contra Academicos, Augustine relies almost exclusively on this distinguishability reading of the third condition, and he still refers to it as Zeno's definition. But Augustine thinks the third condition can be met by many propositions that can't be doubted: mathematical truths, logical truths, seeming claims, etc. And thus for him, there are things of which he can be certain. In other words, he refers to the basis of certainty as the divine ideas on the model of Platonic forms. Though Augustine doesn't use the same term, eudicium, for the criterion that Cicero does, he's still trying to answer the criterion problem in his writing. Henry of Ghent draws from both the Academica and the Contra Academicos and follows Augustine in many ways. He too emphasizes the distinguishability requirement. Though he never lays out Zeno's definition as such, he does make mention of the importance of finding a criterion using Cicero's terms. For Henry, the criterion cannot be found in the senses, as the Stoics and Epicureans saw, but instead is found in the uncreated exemplar or divine idea. As Henry continues to explain things, the uncreated exemplar is the ultimate source of certainty of one's impressions. Scotus drops most of the Ciceronian Augustinian terminology in his discussions, but he nevertheless continues to discuss without acknowledgement Zeno's third condition using the distinguishability reading emphasized by Henry. Scotus agrees with the Stoics, Augustine, and Henry that this third condition can be met, but instead of focusing on divine ideas, he relies largely on self-evident propositions. Both Augustine and Henry talk about these as well in so many words. And he even moves back towards the Stoics, again without acknowledgement, by finding room for certainty with respect to sensory impressions as well. Scotus emphasizes the importance of certainty, continuing a trend that appears in Augustine and that is amplified in Henry. So finally, we get to Ockham. As with Scotus, his work showed very little terminological continuity with Cicero and Augustine, and also as with Scotus, he focuses heavily on the question of certainty. Interestingly, however, he comes back to the original Stoic causal sense of the third condition when he discusses his account of the notion of an intuitive cognition. As Wingert suggests, an intuitive cognition seems to be roughly the same sort of thing as a Stoic cataleptic impression. Most modern scholars emphasize the importance of Aristotle and to a lesser degree the importance of such figures as Plato, Augustine, and Averroes or later medieval epistemology, and they're right to do so since these influences are both obvious and thorough. But if what I've been arguing for in this paper is correct, Stoicism and its focus on the criterion problem played a role in the thought of the period that should not be ignored. Okay, that's all I got.
Thank you, Charles. This was great. Let's see.
Stop the sharing.
Yes, that's better. All right, the floor is open for questions. Well, I have one. It's about Ockham. So I was wondering, so is there a criterion problem for the abstractive cognition bit? Or, I mean, because we seem to be able to err in our abstractive judgments as well, right? That seems kind of obvious. And I was wondering if he has anything to say about how we can sort of distinguish the right kind of abstractive judgments from the wrong kind.
That's a good question. I'm not sure what to say there. I was focusing primarily on that intuitive cognition because it more directly relates to that earlier things. Let me try to think about this a little bit. So if you got an abstractive cognition, it's not necessary that cognition accord with something else. So I think to talk about that as being having a criterion issue, I think it's just one way to understand that, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you. Carrie.
Thank you so much. That was a very rich paper. And there was a whole
presentation, I'm sorry. So.
It was great. So there's a whole lot in there, and but I kept sort of returning to an idea that was raised by the previous paper about the resilience of language. And so I was wondering here, as I was thinking about that notion and applying it to what you were talking about, the resilience of the sort of the language used to examine the criterion problem as we move through the Stoic and into the Augustinian tradition. And then it's as you pointed out, it gets lost with Scotus and Ockham. Not completely lost, but it changes. So do you have an idea of why that language sort of fades away and focuses on different ways of examining the criterion problem?
Yeah, well, the way that I look at it, I think Scotus and Ockham they're primarily philosophers and they're not textual historians, right? And so, number one, they didn't have the Stoic text to go back to. The Cicero, they didn't seem to really be messing with very much. And so what they seem to be doing is just taking the nugget of the idea and running with that without worrying so much about its source. So that's what I think is really going on. But I mean, one of the fascinating things to me about these guys is the way that they're still pulling from these earlier traditions in important ways. And I would like it if they would have footnotes and tell me where they're getting all this stuff. Of course they don't. But anyway, that's my reading. They're more philosophers than textual historians.
Thank you very much. I think that's actually one really helpful way of kind of considering why they would delve more deeply in, changing the language to really grasp the nature of the problems that they were looking at.
Uh-huh. And then, is it Carrie? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, Carrie.
Yeah, and to go beyond that, also, they're pulling from lots of other traditions too, and so they're trying to incorporate, Aristotelian ways of talking about things. These things are Averroistic ways of talking about these things, and so with all of that, necessarily they're going to have to do some kind of moving around the terms to make it fit all this stuff.
Thank you,
Philip. Your turn.
Thank you so much. And I have a quick suggestion about the terminology that you use, and I have one quick question about Ockham and his relationship between Ockham and Zeno, Stoic. So you often say the ontologically distinguishable versus epistemologically indistinguishable, something like that. Ontologically distinguishable acts and epistemically indistinguishable act, and I think it might be misleading because according to some epistemic position, if you have cognition of two ontologically distinguishable acts, that makes the epistemic difference between two cognition of ontologically distinguishable act. For instance, causal externalist will say that. So I would prefer to call, rather than saying that epistemically indistinguishable act, I would prefer to call it phenomenologically or subjectively indistinguishable act, something like that.
Yeah,
So in that way, yeah.
Yeah,
So that's the,
right there. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed, but as I was running through the paper, I tended to move towards that distinguishability talk and subjectivity talk later, because I was having the same worry. But
yeah.
pointed it out.
So yeah,
it was
that's
still
a
earlier there.
quick suggestion. And I have a question about the Ockham. So, when he tried to characterize the nature of intuitive cognition, he often emphasized the kind of functional role in forming an evident judgment, right? Intuitive cognition contribute to forming an evident judgment. So there's some emphasis on the functional role of intuitive cognition. So I was wondering whether that kind of functional characterization can be found in Stoics or Zeno.
That's a good question. Yeah, the version of Kataleptic impressions that I presented in this paper is really simplified, because there are lots of, in the literature there's lots of questions about whether it applies to objects or to what they call lecta or propositions. And so there's a lot of complexity there. And because we don't have many texts, it's really unclear exactly what's going on there. So I don't know the direct answer to your question, but I'm betting someone has looked into that, but someone is not me. But yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks.
Well,
Yeah, I'm wondering, Chip, whether you've got any views about the lines of transmission that get us from Stoicism into the Latin tradition and eventually into the late medieval tradition.
Well, yeah, so I was looking into that. There are a couple of books that have tried to trace. There's one fairly recently that tried to trace half of Cicero's Academica and its progress later into the Middle Ages. There was another one earlier that looked at Sextus and how that kind of worked its way through. And basically there was a long period where you had nothing at all. And the first, I'm trying to think when the first thing, John of Salisbury talks about the Stoics and skeptics, but the thought is that he was probably working from an epitome rather than one of these texts itself. Again, I'm trying to recall this. I'm not completely clear on this. As far as the Academica, there were a couple of different versions that were in circulation. I think one was fairly early in Italy. And so we've been able to find some traces of that, but it doesn't seem to have circulated very, very widely. And then obviously Henry had access to the Academica, but there's some thought that it was just kind of passed privately from person to person because it wasn't widely copied. And the Contra Academicos, there were a few more copies out there going around, but again, there weren't a lot of citations of that. I've just kind of started looking into this, so I'm not as widely read as I should be about where this is. I had read something. Who's the fellow? He wrote he had that nice collected volume on skepticism a few years ago. I'm blanking on his name, but anyway. He had mentioned that in the posterior analytic commentary tradition, there's more talk of this kind of stuff, but I haven't started looking into that yet. So there may be some there, but that's my rough answer. But I've got some stuff in my footnotes and stuff that I could give you references if you look at it.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question because it's one thing to discover that a work's been translated. That's good to know, or and to discover manuscripts of it. That's good to know, but and then you see references to say Cicero and Henry of Ghent. That's helpful to know, but it does none of that exactly answers the question, because it's one thing to have a reference to a work and another thing to say this is really what was influencing these authors and thinking about this stuff. It's just such difficult questions.
Right.